Tonight we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, Israeli intelligence had tracked, and the entire Middle East had braced for. A chain of events that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in mere hours. Hours that changed the calculus of regional security. Hours that forced world leaders into emergency sessions. Hours that may have redrawn the invisible lines of conflict that have defined the Middle East for decades. What Iran did this week crossed a line that the Biden administration, the Trump transition team, and America's closest allies had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Benjamin Netanyahu did not hesitate. He responded with precision, with overwhelming force, and with a message that no one in Tehran could misinterpret. This is not a story about escalation for its own sake. This is a story about what happens when provocation meets resolve, when threats meet action, and when a nation that has been pushed to the brink decides it will not be pushed any further. Tonight, we bring you live coverage of the most significant military engagement between Israel and Iran in modern history. We will walk you through every detail, what happened, why it happened, and what it means for the region, for America, and for the incoming Trump administration, which just made a decision that has shocked observers on both sides of the Atlantic. Stay with us. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic communications, just signals that Iran was preparing something unprecedented. Iran has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a predictability, almost a rhythm. The proxy attacks through Hezbollah, the drone incursions, the support for Houthi strikes on commercial shipping, all of it followed patterns that Israeli and American intelligence had learned to read like a playbook. But what set off alarm bells in Jerusalem and Washington this past week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian military activity know the indicators. The movement of ballistic missile components, the sudden activation of encrypted communication channels, the repositioning of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders, the sudden withdrawal of diplomatic personnel from vulnerable posts, all of that went quiet. And whenever Iran goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Israeli intelligence services, specifically Mossad and Unit 8200, have been tracking what they internally termed Operation Shadow Dawn, a suspected Iranian plan to conduct a large-scale strike on Israeli infrastructure that would be substantial enough to cause real damage, but deniable enough to avoid triggering a full regional war. The problem was, Israel had intercepted communications suggesting that Iran's definition of deniable had changed. Tehran was no longer interested in maintaining the thin fiction of proxy warfare. They were preparing to act directly, and they were preparing to act soon. Early Tuesday morning, Israeli military intelligence detected what they described as an imminent threat posture from Iranian forces, including the fueling of medium-range ballistic missiles that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Iran only deploys when they are signaling something very specific. Imminent attack, strategic repositioning, or a complete shift in doctrine. Israeli officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Iran was changing its military posture. And when a hostile state power shifts posture without explanation, even by small degrees, every intelligence agency in the region pays attention. What made this moment different was the timing. The United States was in the middle of a presidential transition. Donald Trump had won the election decisively, but the formal transfer of power was still weeks away. The Biden administration was functioning in caretaker mode, reluctant to make major foreign policy moves that would bind the incoming president. Iran saw this as an opportunity, a window of American uncertainty, a moment when the world's most powerful nation was looking inward, distracted by domestic politics, and potentially slow to respond. They calculated that a strike during this transition period would face a muted American response. They calculated wrong. The warning issued by U.S. intelligence to Israeli counterparts Tuesday evening was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after source who attended the emergency briefings described Iran's preparations as imminent, substantial, and perhaps most importantly, irreversible. Once initiated, Iran's strategy appeared to be one of fait accompli. Strike hard, strike fast, and present the world with a situation that was already over before anyone could respond. But fait accompli only works if the target hesitates. Israel did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive military actions we've seen in the Middle East in decades. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of confirming Iran's attack preparations, the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Iron Resolve. These weren't the limited, surgical strikes we've seen Israel conduct against Iranian proxies in Syria. These were deep penetration missions. F-35I Adir stealth fighters supported by electronic warfare aircraft and aerial refueling tankers, systems that Israel only deploys when they are preparing to strike at the heart of an enemy's military capability. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking to his security cabinet, reportedly said, "We will not wait to be struck. We will not absorb a first blow, and we will not give Iran the satisfaction of setting the terms of this engagement." Within hours, Israeli aircraft were over Iranian airspace. Tonight, the Israeli Defense Forces confirmed that they launched coordinated strikes on multiple Iranian military installations, including a missile production facility near Isfahan that had recently been hardened with additional concrete reinforcement for what analysts believe was preparation for exactly this kind of attack. Israel struck before Iran could launch. They hit the missile fueling stations. They hit the command and control centers coordinating the planned attack. They hit the logistics depots that were preparing to supply the operation. In other words, Israel targeted the nervous system of Iran's offensive capability, the infrastructure that would have made their attack operational. This is what made American intelligence's warning so urgent. Iran's preparations weren't just symbolic, they were actionable. They represented the kind of imminent threat that could have killed hundreds of Israeli civilians if left unchecked. And Netanyahu, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. Israeli forces didn't carpet bomb civilian areas. They didn't strike Iran's nuclear facilities, which would have triggered an even larger crisis. They hit military targets. They hit command infrastructure. They hit the specific assets that posed the most immediate threat. This distinction matters. It shows that Israel was not seeking to start a wider war. They were seeking to prevent one by eliminating the capability Iran needed to strike first. Defense analysts we've spoken to describe the operation as textbook preemptive defense, the kind of action that international law recognizes as legitimate when a nation faces an imminent, credible threat. And the threat Israel faced was both imminent and credible. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Iran's latest preparations were designed to test the resolve of both Israel and the United States after the perceived uncertainty of the American election. Iran wanted to see whether Israel would hesitate during the transition period. They wanted to see whether Washington would be too distracted to respond. But instead, the opposite happened. Israel didn't hesitate. They launched a response that was so swift, so precise, that even Iranian military commanders were caught off guard. You don't catch the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps off guard easily. But today, Israel did. Senior defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Iran's positioning as opportunistic aggression, a way to exploit perceived Western weakness during a moment of political transition. But Israel proved today that they remain both capable and willing to act decisively. Their strikes were not only successful, they were calibrated so precisely that Iranian air defenses, widely regarded as among the most sophisticated in the region, failed to intercept a single Israeli aircraft. That detail matters because it shows Israeli military superiority remains intact. It shows that Israel is not simply reacting to Iranian provocations. They are shaping the battlefield. They are demonstrating that any Iranian aggression will be met with consequences that Tehran cannot afford. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Israel's response. Israeli Air Force jets carried out over 40 individual strike missions, forcing Iranian air defenses into confusion and eventually exhaustion. Israeli cyber warfare units targeted Iranian military communication networks that had been upgraded in the last 6 months. Israeli naval assets operating in the eastern Mediterranean reportedly disabled radar installations used by Iran to coordinate with Hezbollah in Lebanon. This wasn't just a defensive operation. This wasn't just a limited strike. This was a comprehensive degradation of Iranian offensive capability. This was strategic dominance. And strategic dominance is the one thing Iran has struggled to maintain since their failed missile barrage against Israel earlier this year. For every advance they have made, every proxy militia armed, every missile deployed, every threatening statement issued, Israel has countered with something that makes the next Iranian move more costly, more difficult, and more dangerous. Tonight was the most dramatic example of that pattern. Iran prepared for war. Israel made sure they couldn't fight it. Remember, Iran thought the American transition period would paralyze decision-making in Washington. They thought Israel would be reluctant to act without explicit American approval. They thought the international community would pressure Jerusalem into restraint. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Washington is standing firmly behind Israel. The international community, while calling for calm, has not condemned Israel's actions. And Jerusalem has made clear that restraint is no longer an option when facing imminent threats. This represents a fundamental shift in the regional balance of power. For decades, Iran has operated under the assumption that it could push, provoke, and threaten without facing direct consequences on its own soil. That assumption died tonight. Israeli aircraft flew over Iranian territory. Israeli missiles struck Iranian military installations. Israeli forces demonstrated that Iran's much-vaunted air defenses could not protect them. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Iran's latest provocation happened at a time when Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners in Tehran want escalation with Israel. Reformists want economic relief from sanctions. The Revolutionary Guard wants to demonstrate military relevance. The Iranian public wants stability and an end to international isolation. Khamenei is balancing these competing demands while managing a succession crisis that everyone knows is coming, but no one is allowed to discuss publicly. And when leaders in that position make sudden aggressive moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because domestic politics demands action, even when strategic logic counsels restraint. This is what makes the current situation so volatile. Iran's leadership is not acting rationally in the traditional sense. They're acting politically, trying to shore up internal support by demonstrating external strength. And that kind of decision-making is unpredictable. It's dangerous, and it requires exactly the kind of decisive response that Israel delivered tonight. The statement issued by the White House tonight, now being circulated to all major international partners, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow further Iranian escalation. Senior officials said plainly that Iran's attack preparations were inconsistent with any claim of peaceful intent. That is diplomatic language for, "We know exactly what you were planning, and we're not going to tolerate it." You don't usually hear that tone from the outgoing Biden administration unless something serious is at stake. But more significant was the statement from the incoming Trump administration. And this is where tonight's story takes its most shocking turn. President-elect Donald Trump, speaking through his transition team, made a decision that has stunned foreign policy observers across the political spectrum. He publicly endorsed Israel's preemptive strikes, not through diplomatic back channels, not through carefully worded statements. Directly, unambiguously, forcefully, Trump said, Israel has the absolute right to defend itself against Iranian aggression. They didn't wait to be attacked. They took action. That's what strong nations do. He said, "The days of America telling our allies to show restraint while their enemies prepare to kill them are over." And he said, "When I take office, Iran will understand that there is no daylight between the United States and Israel. None." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an incoming commander-in-chief that understands just how high the stakes have become. Trump's endorsement represents a complete break from the careful, measured approach the Biden administration had tried to maintain. It signals to Iran that the incoming American administration will not pressure Israel into restraint. It signals to America's Gulf allies that Washington is prepared to take a harder line against Tehran. And it signals to the world that the period of American uncertainty is ending. A new posture is coming, and that posture involves standing firmly, publicly, and unconditionally with Israel. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Iran's attack preparations weren't isolated. Along with the missile fueling in central Iran, Hezbollah forces in Lebanon also moved artillery assets closer to the Israeli border. Houthi rebels in Yemen launched another wave of anti-ship missiles targeting commercial vessels. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq increased drone attacks, targeting U.S. military installations. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When Iran moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This wasn't a single provocation. This was a coordinated regional offensive designed to stretch Israeli and American attention across multiple fronts simultaneously. The goal was to create chaos, to overwhelm response capabilities, to present so many threats at once that some would inevitably succeed. But Israel's preemptive action disrupted the entire strategy. By striking the command center in Iran, they cut the head off the operation before the body could move. Hezbollah's artillery movement stalled. The Houthi attacks continued but lacked coordination. The Iraqi militia strikes were answered with American air power. The entire Iranian strategy collapsed because Israel acted first. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Iran is preparing retaliatory strikes against Israeli or American interests in the region. Another is that Iran is attempting to de-escalate quietly while saving face domestically. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Iran is attempting to accelerate its nuclear weapons program as the ultimate deterrent against future Israeli action. But today, Israel took that calculation off the table. They didn't wait for international approval. They didn't engage in months of diplomatic negotiations. They didn't allow Iran to dictate the timeline. They acted, and in acting, they demonstrated that Iran's nuclear ambitions will not provide immunity from consequences. If anything, tonight's events make clear that Israel is prepared to act preemptively against even more sensitive targets if Iranian behavior doesn't change. The message is unmistakable. There is no safe harbor for Iranian aggression. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Iran wants to see if international pressure will restrain Israel from further action. Israel wants to show that it will act independently to defend itself, regardless of international opinion. The Biden administration wants to prevent a wider regional war during its final weeks in office. And the Trump administration wants to prevent any perception of American weakness that could invite further aggression. These competing objectives are playing out in real time. Every statement, every military movement, every diplomatic communication is being watched and analyzed by all parties. The next 48 hours will be critical. If Iran backs down, this crisis may subside. If Iran escalates, we could see the beginning of the largest Middle Eastern conflict since the Gulf War. The stakes could not be higher. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Iranian military movements in real time. They say Iranian air defenses remain on high alert across the country. They say Revolutionary Guard commanders have dispersed to secondary command locations, suggesting fear of follow-up Israeli strikes. And they say Iran's decision to prepare offensive operations was likely part of a broader strategy intended to test American commitment during the presidential transition. But Israel is not backing down. In fact, Israel is reinforcing success. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Iran that further aggression will be met with even greater consequences. And it sent a message to the United States that Israel remains the most capable and reliable military partner in the region. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his address to the Israeli public tonight, was clear: we did not seek this confrontation. Iran chose it. And when our enemies choose confrontation, they will find that Israel is always prepared, always capable, always willing to defend our people. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Iran hoped to achieve with their attack preparations. But what we do know is that Israel's preemptive action was timely. It prevented what could have been a devastating missile barrage against Israeli cities. It degraded Iranian offensive capabilities for months, possibly years. And it restored deterrence that had been eroding throughout the past year of regional conflict. What happens next will depend on what Iran does in the next 72 hours. If they choose de-escalation, this moment will be remembered as the night Israel re-established the rules of engagement in the Middle East. If they choose further escalation, Israel and the United States have already shown they are ready. They have shown they are prepared to respond with overwhelming force. They have shown that the costs of Iranian aggression will always exceed any possible gains. President-elect Trump's endorsement of Israel's actions adds another dimension to this calculation. Iran now knows that the incoming American administration will not restrain Israel. They know that Washington and Jerusalem are aligned. They know that the strategic environment they hope to exploit is closing rapidly. The window of opportunity Iran thought they had is slamming shut. And tonight, for the first time in years, Iran appears to be genuinely uncertain about its next move. Tehran is quiet, too quiet. And when Iran is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are weighing options that have suddenly become far more limited. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Iran learned something they should have understood long ago. Israel will not wait to be attacked. The United States will stand with its allies, and aggression will always be answered. This story is far from over. The region remains on edge. The potential for escalation remains real. But tonight, one thing is clear. Israel has demonstrated that it will defend itself by any means necessary. The United States has signaled that the era of pressuring allies into dangerous restraint is ending. And Iran has been reminded that its ambitions come with costs they may not be able to pay. We will continue monitoring this situation throughout the night. We will bring you every update as it happens. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this historic confrontation unfolds. Stay with us.